April 27, 1945. The war was ending, but no one in the camp near Bavaria believed that fact just yet. The barbed wire still hummed when the cold wind moved across it, and boots sank into mud that smelled of rust and damp hay. German women stood in rows, wrapped in coats that were more patches than fabric, their eyes heavy with exhaustion and a certain fear they did not want to show. They had been told, for years, that capture by Americans meant humiliation, starvation, perhaps worse. And so, when the gates clanged open and an American soldier walked in carrying a bundle wrapped in a blanket stitched with an insignia of the U.S. Army, every breath in that yard seemed to stop. The soldier, broad-shouldered and young enough to still have boyish cheeks, adjusted the bundle as if he were holding something fragile, and when the blanket shifted, the pink face of a baby peeked out. For the first time in weeks, some of the women blinked as though sunlight had struck them. The silence was not only shock, it was disbelief colliding with hope, and hope felt dangerous. The women who had been swept into this place were not soldiers in the truest sense. They were auxiliaries, nurses, civilians caught in retreat, and a handful who had been pressed into uniform when the Reich began collapsing from within. They carried themselves with rigid spines, because anything less would invite judgment from both sides, from the Americans who watched them and from the German men who still thought weakness was a crime. Yet beneath those stiffened shoulders, many carried a deeper weight. Some had been separated from their children at the moment of capture. Infants too small to march had been taken into makeshift medical tents where American nurses tried, with little training and much determination, to keep them alive. A mother's body remembers every hour apart from her child. That is why, when the soldier stepped forward with the baby, one woman gasped as if the earth itself had split. Her name was Marta Weber, 29, once a clerk in Frankfurt, now labeled a prisoner of war. Her husband had vanished on the Eastern Front 2 years before, and she had been left with an infant son when the Allies swept across the Rhine. During the capture, he was taken from her arms, not cruelly but firmly, as soldiers tried to separate the weak from the marching column. Marta had spent nights hearing phantom cries in her ears, pressing her palms against her face to smother the sound. She told herself she would not break in front of the guards. She told herself that if she did not weep, she would keep some shred of dignity. Yet when the soldier now turned and gently lowered the child into her arms, every defense cracked. Tears ran down her cheeks before she could stop them. The boy squirmed, thin but breathing, and when his small fist clutched the frayed string of her coat, Marta folded over him as though she might collapse. The other women stared, and then, as if the dam of their own control had given way, a murmur rose, a chorus of longing that could no longer be contained. The Americans had not expected this. Many of them were farm boys from Iowa, mechanics from Detroit, or teachers pulled into uniforms by a war they had not asked for. They had been trained to see Germans as enemies, as faceless masses in helmets who had bombed cities and slaughtered innocents. Yet here were women, their cheeks hollow, their shoes worn thin, looking less like villains and more like neighbors who had stumbled into the wrong century. The baby in Marta's arms was crying now, and when one of the soldiers tried to hand her a tin cup with milk, his hands shook as if he feared he might break some unspoken law. Later, in letters home, these men would write not about battles but about that strange silence in the camp when mothers held their children again. It was, for them, a more disarming moment than combat had ever been. Still, the women did not fully trust what they were seeing. They had been told by propaganda that Americans would punish them with cruelty. Leaflets had warned that their children would be taken forever. Even now, Marta's grip on her son was so tight that her knuckles turned white. Around her, others whispered prayers, fragments of hymns, or muttered disbelief. One woman asked aloud, "Why would they give them back?" The question hung heavy in the air. The answer was not simple, but it began with a document signed years earlier in Geneva. The Americans, unlike the chaos of the Eastern Front, operated with rules that demanded prisoners be fed, housed, and kept alive, and, when possible, allowed contact with their families. In this camp, It meant mothers were permitted to hold their babies under supervision. It was not generosity so much as procedure, but to the women, it felt like a miracle carved out of stone. The central conflict was no longer just between nations. It was inside each prisoner, between what they had been told and what they now saw. They had been taught to expect monsters, yet the soldiers who guarded them looked as weary and homesick as they were. One soldier even joked, half smiling, that American rations would make the babies grow big enough to beat us in baseball. The women did not understand the joke, but they understood the ease in his tone. It made the barbed wire feel less sharp, if only for a moment. Still, the barbed wire was there and no one forgot it. Freedom was distant, homes lay in ruins, and the men they had once depended on were either dead, missing, or locked away in other camps. The babies reminded them that life pressed forward even when history tried to grind it down. Marta whispered to her son in a trembling voice, promising he would eat again, promising he would never leave her arms if she could help it. The soldier who had given him back shifted uncomfortably, unsure if he should stay or retreat. He finally stepped back, his boots splashing in the mud, leaving mother and child to their fragile reunion. The women around Marta leaned closer, their faces illuminated not by fire or light, but by something they dared not name. Hope. It was a dangerous thing, hope, because it could be ripped away again. Yet in that instant they could not resist it. They had seen the impossible, an enemy who returned what war had taken. As the sun dipped behind gray Bavarian hills, the women clutched their children and refused to let go. The guards let them stay longer than regulations allowed, pretending not to notice. Some tried to smile, others stood stiff, but all understood that something irrevocable had shifted. This was not victory, not yet forgiveness, but a thread of humanity stretched across wire. And it left both sides wondering what would come next, when the world outside those fences finally demanded they face each other without babies to soften the distance. The following days inside the camp unfolded with a rhythm that none of the German women had expected, a rhythm that seemed almost ordinary, though its ordinariness felt like a trick of the mind. Marta Weber, still holding her son whenever regulations allowed, began to notice how each woman coped differently with the fragile miracle of reunion. Some mothers clung with frantic devotion, whispering lullabies until their voices cracked. Others sat in stunned silence, as if still afraid to believe that the babies would not be taken again. The American guards watched all of this with an awkward patience, uneasy at the way enemies suddenly looked like family. For Marta, the conflict was constant. Gratitude that her child was alive pressed against the gnawing fear that kindness could be temporary, that at any moment, someone might stride in and remind them they were prisoners. She knew her life had become a balancing act between holding on to hope and refusing to trust it too much. The camp itself was no paradise. The barracks smelled of damp wool and smoke. Rations were measured, the bread often stale, the potatoes boiled to a tasteless mash. Yet compared to the hunger she had left behind in Frankfurt, it was abundance. Marta remembered days when her son's lips had turned pale for lack of milk, when she had boiled weeds and nettles to keep herself from fainting. Here, American soldiers handed out tins of condensed milk and small wrapped chocolates that looked like treasure. The contrast was almost unbearable. One evening, when a soldier passed a square of chocolate through the wire, Marta hesitated before giving it to her child. She stared at it as though it might be poison, then watched him devour it with sticky joy. Tears rose unbidden. She realized then that the Americans had disarmed her not with weapons but with the simple act of feeding her son. Rumors spread quickly among the women. One whispered that a Red Cross nurse had written letters for them, sending news across oceans to families they thought lost forever. Another swore she had seen her baby being bathed by an American nurse with lavender soap that filled the tent with a scent long forgotten. The women leaned on these whispers, clutching them as tightly as their children. Marta remained skeptical, but she felt her defenses soften each time her son stirred in her arms. She began to study the guards, to notice the ways they shifted when the women wept or the way one of them, a tall soldier with a tired face, carried babies with the clumsy tenderness of someone who had never held a child before. She realized the enemy had faces, not caricatures, and that realization unsettled her more than hatred ever had. One afternoon, a moment unfolded that pressed this truth deeper. A young mother named Liesel collapsed in the yard, her strength drained after weeks of anxiety. She had been separated from her infant daughter at capture, and though reassured, she had not yet seen the child again. When the guards rushed to her side, she cried out a single name, Anna, over and over. The camp grew quiet. Minutes later, an American nurse emerged, carrying a swaddled baby. Liesel struggled to her feet, trembling as if her body might break before she reached her daughter. When the child was finally placed in her arms, the entire yard seemed to exhale. Even the soldiers stood still, some turning their faces away. Marta, watching this, felt something shift inside her. She thought of her own son's fragile breath against her neck and wondered how long one could keep pretending not to feel the same as the other women. That night, the women huddled together in the barracks, whispering about what they had seen. Some were cautious, insisting it was a performance meant to break their spirit. Others believed it was proof that not all enemies were cruel. Marta did not speak. She sat with her son against her chest, the rhythm of his breathing both an anchor and a wound. The central conflict burned sharper now. To hate the Americans was simple, to see them as humans was dangerous. If she allowed herself to believe in their kindness, what would that mean for everything she had endured, for the husband she had lost, for the years she had carried the weight of loyalty to a crumbling Reich? She told herself the safest path was silence. Yet silence did not stop her heart from softening each time her son reached for the cup of milk an American handed her. The guards, too, were undergoing their own transformations. Letters written later by men in that camp described confusion more than triumph. One soldier admitted, "I thought they'd spit on us. Instead they cried. I felt more like a thief returning stolen goods than a victor." Another wrote home, confessing he had expected to despise German women but had been disarmed by the way one of them kissed her baby's forehead with such desperation that he could not eat his dinner afterward. Humor crept into their accounts as well, awkward and fumbling. "German babies cry louder than ours," one soldier joked, though the laughter carried unease, as if joking was the only way to mask the strangeness of compassion. For the women, compassion was both balm and weapon. Marta noticed how her fellow prisoners began to change. Where once they had stood stiff, waiting for punishment, they now allowed themselves moments of tenderness. A lullaby sung too loudly, a smile at the soldier who passed a piece of bread, a whispered thank you. Marta resisted at first, but the resistance frayed with each passing day. When her son began to giggle, a sound she thought lost to hunger, she realized she was no longer the woman she had been when she walked through those gates. The war inside her was shifting, a new conflict replacing the old. Was it betrayal to feel gratitude toward the enemy, or was it simply human? The tension built toward an inevitable release. One morning, the women were assembled in the recreation hall, their children brought in from the medical tents. The Americans lined the walls, uncertain, watching. The mothers reached out, and babies were handed over in a solemn ritual. Marta stood among them, clutching her son, and in that moment, something larger than herself unfolded. Tears fell, voices cracked, and for the first time since capture, laughter broke through the air, brittle and brief but undeniable. It was not freedom, but it was life. It was proof that humanity had not been extinguished by war's machinery. The Americans let the scene linger longer than orders required. When the women were finally guided back toward the barracks, they walked not as prisoners but as mothers who had, if only for a breath, been restored. As dusk settled, Marta lay awake with her son beside her. She knew the wire still stood, that tomorrow could bring new cruelties, new reminders of their place as captives. Yet she also knew something irreversible had happened. The enemy had given back more than food or blankets. They had returned her child. That act defied every expectation, every lie she had been told, every wall she had built around her heart. She whispered into the dark, not to her son, not to herself, but to the world that had turned upside down. If this is war, then war has lost its shape. The thought frightened her, but it would not leave. And she sensed, though she could not yet see, that this was only the beginning of a transformation neither she nor her captors fully understood. By May of 1945, the camp had settled into an uneasy rhythm, a fragile balance between discipline and unexpected tenderness. Each day seemed to stretch into the next with the same sequence of roll calls, meager meals, and the hum of distant trucks carrying supplies. Yet beneath that monotony, something deeper was shifting. The women were no longer faceless prisoners to the guards, and the guards were no longer faceless enemies to the women. They had seen one another in moments too intimate to be erased. A baby's cry answered by a soldier's hesitant hand, a mother's collapse soothed by the same men she had been taught to fear. The central conflict now lay in the widening gap between what both sides had been told to believe and what they now experienced firsthand. Marta Weber found herself at the heart of this transformation. She was not a leader among the women by rank or position, but by the steady quietness with which she carried herself. Other prisoners began to gravitate toward her, asking questions in low whispers. What did she think the Americans really wanted, how long before they were sent home, whether the kindness could be trusted? Marta had no answers, but her calm demeanor steadied them. She tried to hide her own confusion, though inside she wrestled with contradictions. Each time her son reached for an American nurse's sleeve, smiling with innocent delight, Marta felt a mixture of gratitude and shame. Gratitude because her boy was alive and nourished. Shame because the enemy's kindness threatened to undo the hard wall of resistance she had built within herself. The Americans too were caught in this invisible tug of war. Private James Callahan, the young soldier who had first handed Marta's baby back to her, struggled to reconcile duty with empathy. At night he wrote in a pocket notebook, the words cramped and hurried, "It is hard to think of them as Nazis when they cry like my sister did when she lost her firstborn. Harder still to remember they are prisoners when the little one grabs my finger and laughs." He was not supposed to see them as individuals, but the longer he stayed, the harder that order became to follow. He began to learn names: Marta, Liesel, Gertrude. They were no longer just statistics in a camp ledger but women with histories, with children who would grow whether war wanted them to or not. The central question that grew louder in those weeks was not whether survival was possible, but whether humanity could survive inside captivity. Propaganda had painted the enemy as monstrous, yet what the women now saw were men no older than their brothers, men with tired faces and nervous jokes. One evening during a supervised gathering, a guard clumsily imitated the way German babies wailed, and though the women tried to suppress it, laughter burst out among them. It was brief, almost scandalous, as though joy itself were forbidden. But it echoed long after, loosening something that had been clenched too tightly. Marta found herself smiling despite every reason not to. She caught Callahan watching and he quickly looked away embarrassed. The fence between them remained, but it no longer felt impenetrable. Yet trust was never simple. Some women resisted any softening, reminding the others of bombed-out cities, of brothers lost, of hunger gnawing at families back home. They argued that the Americans were performing generosity as theater, to ease their consciences or use as propaganda. And perhaps they were right. Records from the time would later show that the U.S. Army did document these scenes, photographs capturing mothers reunited with children, evidence of humane treatment present to the world. But to Marta the photographs did not matter. What mattered was the weight of her son in her arms, the undeniable warmth of his body. No political calculation could erase that moment of restoration. Still, guilt accompanied her relief. Was it betrayal to accept kindness from the men her people had fought against, or betrayal to deny her son's safety when it was offered? Numbers told one story, feelings told another. Over 11 million Germans were held as prisoners across Europe by war's end, and within that vast ocean of captivity, stories like Marta's were but a drop. Yet in that drop lived a world entire. Reports recorded that hundreds of infants were born inside or around POW camps in those years, living proof that even among barbed wire, life refused to yield. Marta often thought about this when she watched her son sleep. He was one of many, but to her he was the center of everything. She wondered how many other mothers in other camps clutched their babies with the same desperate love, and whether those mothers too looked across fences and saw enemies become men. The tension reached another breaking point one afternoon when the women were gathered to receive parcels from the Red Cross. Inside were soap bars, tins of food, sometimes even letters. Marta opened her parcel with trembling hands and found, to her disbelief, a slip of paper bearing her sister's handwriting. The words were brief, hurried, but enough. They were alive in Frankfurt, though the city lay in ruins. Marta clutched the note until it nearly tore. She read it to the others, who leaned in with burning eyes, desperate to share the hope. That evening, the barracks glowed with whispers, fragments of news carried like fragile flames. The Americans had given them more than food or parcels. They had reopened the thread between them and the world they thought lost. Marta understood then that kindness was not a weakness. It was power, the power to reshape what war had twisted. Still, she could not escape the complexity of it. When she looked at Callahan, she wondered if she hated him less than she should. When her son reached for the chocolate he slipped into her hand, she felt both relief and suspicion. She wanted to protect her child from hunger, but also from forgetting. Forgetting that they were still behind wire, that their homes were rubble, that their lives were not their own. The central conflict was no longer between two nations but within every heart that beat inside the camp. To trust or not to trust, to feel gratitude or to resist, it was a choice no less weighty than survival itself. As summer approached, the camp seemed to breathe differently. Flowers pushed through cracks in the fence line, and children's laughter mingled with the hum of trucks. The women walked more slowly now, not with pride but with a kind of fragile dignity that had been restored by the presence of their children. The guards, once stiff with suspicion, now carried themselves with a weariness softened by empathy. Both sides remained prisoners of circumstance, bound by orders, by war, by histories too heavy to lift. Yet within those boundaries something human grew. Marta felt it each time her son pressed his head against her chest and sighed as though the world were safe again. She knew the illusion could shatter in an instant. But illusions, she realized, were what people lived on in war, and sometimes illusions grew into truths. One evening, as the sun bled red across the Bavarian hills, Marta watched Callahan linger near the wire. He did not speak, only nodded when their eyes met. In that nod was something unspoken, an acknowledgement that they were no longer just guard and prisoner but two people caught in the same storm. Marta held her son closer, feeling the warmth of his small body, and wondered how long such fragile connections could survive when the world outside the camp would soon demand harsher reckonings. The question stayed with her as night fell. If kindness could bloom in captivity, what might it mean once the gates finally opened? By the autumn of 1945, the war was finished on paper, though its echo still shook the bones of everyone inside the camp. The barbed wire remained, the guards still paced their routes, and the women still slept on wooden cots under the sound of boots and whistles. Yet the war within hearts had changed. Marta Weber, once rigid with suspicion, now lived in a state of constant contradiction. She could not deny that her son's cheeks had filled with color under American care, that his giggle rang out with a brightness she had thought impossible during the final year of bombing raids. At the same time, she felt the unbearable weight of knowing she owed his survival to the very men who had destroyed the world she once called home. Each time she looked at Private James Callahan across the yard, she felt that tension tighten. Part gratitude, part resentment, part something else she could not name. The camp's routine carried a quiet transformation that all could feel. Soldiers who once barked orders now softened their tone without realizing it. Mothers who had once whispered only fear now whispered plans of returning home, rebuilding, finding the scattered remnants of family. Even laughter, cautious and fleeting, had begun to appear in the barracks. Yet every small joy reminded Marta of the larger truth. They were still prisoners and freedom had not yet been restored. The central conflict no longer lay in whether survival was possible, but in what survival meant when the world outside the fences was rubble and silence. The women wondered aloud whether their homes still stood, whether their loved ones still breathed, and whether there would be any place to return to once the gates opened. It was in this climate of fragile hope that a final test arrived. Orders came that some of the women and children would soon be released and sent back into occupied Germany. The news struck like lightning. For some it was a miracle, for others it was terror. Stories of the destruction awaiting them circulated through the barracks. Cities gutted by firebombs, families scattered like ash. Marta felt torn in two directions: the longing to return to her sister and the dread of carrying her child into a country she scarcely recognized anymore. Freedom meant facing the ruins, and in a strange way captivity had begun to feel safer. The announcement stirred something in the guards as well. Callahan found himself watching Marta more closely, aware that their time in this suspended world was coming to an end. He told himself she was only another prisoner, yet the truth pressed against him each time he saw her son reach for his finger, each time Marta's eyes met his with a weary acknowledgement. He felt the guilt of kindness, knowing that once she stepped beyond the wire, he would never see her again, and whatever fragile bridge had been built between them would collapse under the weight of history. His letters home became heavier, confessing that he no longer knew how to separate the duty of a soldier from the duty of a man simply trying to remain human in a world that demanded hatred. On the final evening before departure, the women were gathered in the hall one last time with their children. The Americans handed out parcels for the journey: bread, powdered milk, blankets. Marta clutched hers tightly, the texture of the fabric both comfort and reminder. Around her, mothers wept with relief, some with fear. Liesel, the young mother who had once collapsed in the yard, kissed her daughter's forehead and whispered that tomorrow they would see the streets of home again, though neither of them knew what home meant now. The air carried a charge like the moment before a storm. Everyone knew this gathering was different. It was not another routine of survival but a threshold that once crossed could never be undone. The climax came quietly, without speeches or fanfare. As the women prepared to leave, Callahan approached Marta. He did not carry authority, he was just a private, a boy turned soldier, but in his eyes was the weight of something larger. He handed her a small object wrapped in cloth. She opened it carefully and found inside a child's blanket, patched from scraps of American uniforms, the insignia stitched into one corner. It was crude, uneven, but unmistakably made by hand. Marta's breath caught. Her son reached out and grasped the fabric, pressing it to his face. For a long moment, Marta could not speak. She understood the gift was not policy, not duty, but something human that reached across the gulf between them. It was the acknowledgement that for all the war had taken, life still demanded tenderness. She looked at Callahan, and in her eyes he saw a reflection of his own turmoil. Gratitude and sorrow, trust and distrust, all tangled in a single glance. She whispered, barely audible, "Thank you." It was the first time she had spoken directly to him. He nodded once, his throat tight, and stepped back. The moment lasted only seconds, but for both it carried the weight of everything that had happened inside those fences. Neither love nor reconciliation, it was something more fragile, more profound. The recognition of shared humanity, carved out of a world determined to erase it. The next morning, as the gates opened and the women filed out with their children, the camp felt both emptied and transformed. Marta carried her son wrapped in the patched blanket, her steps steady despite the unknown ahead. She did not know what awaited her in Frankfurt, whether her sister's letter would prove true, whether her home still stood. But she knew her child was alive, and she knew that kindness had reached her even in captivity. That knowledge would remain long after the fences faded behind her. For Callahan, watching the column depart, the moment left a scar that was not wound but memory. He realized the war had not only been fought with bullets and bombs but with choices like these, whether to harden the heart or allow it to bend. He knew he would carry the image of Marta and her son for the rest of his life, a reminder that even enemies could share a moment of grace. The story closed not with victory or defeat but with a fragile truth. War had failed to erase the most stubborn force of all, the bond between mother and child, and the strange, unsettling kindness of those once sworn to be enemies. Marta stepped into a ruined world, but she carried with her a child who had survived, a blanket stitched by foreign hands, and the quiet conviction that not all enemies were monsters. In that conviction lay the seed of something greater than war could ever destroy. And for those who watched, it was proof that humanity, though battered, had not been lost.